It's wild that it has been just over 5 years since Imperator Rome originally launched. If you're familiar with this channel, you likely know that I used to cover Rome somewhat regularly in the past. However, due to its cancelled development, I ceased coverage. As much as I loved that IR seemed to be a step closer to making Europa Universalis 4 feel more alive with a dynamic population system, once a game stops live service, the community typically dies out afterwards unless there is a particularly strong modding community. I don't usually put out videos when there has been a deluge of content covering a very specific topic, in this case being Imperator Rome's potential to make a comeback, and to be frank, I don't think it has more than a 5 to 10% chance of making a return anytime soon, just from looking at data and developer comments. However, why I am making this video isn't just to seize on trending content as usual, but to talk about why Imperator Rome specifically failed, and why new games like EU5 coming out could further complicate things. This video doesn't serve to pose and answer a question by the end of it, but it more so tries to raise multiple questions and allows you as an audience to decide, because while there is a lot to comb through in terms of sources and dev diaries, and I've spent a lot of time raking through the various patches and patch notes, the details are still vague and spotty. Also, I do want to talk about Paradox's DLC policy because it is a centralizing force, very much a Dahomey in the room if you catch my reference, throughout all of their titles and had a significant role to play in this game's development, at least in my opinion. But before you grab your pitchforks, I love Imperator for what it is. I think it is a great sandbox depicting the early rise of the Roman Republic, and it can be fun to mess around in an era that doesn't see that much representation in the grand strategy genre nowadays. But the fact remains that the revival, quote unquote, that many channels are talking about did not see that much showing, which is unfortunate. I really appreciate YouTubers coming together to bring awareness and momentum to any cause they are passionate about, especially forgotten games like this one. On its face, however, Imperator Rome managed to raise a meager levy of 2,000 players for its anniversary patch. This is even less than last year, which isn't all that surprising to be fair, and yet it is still incredibly demoralizing to see such an effort result in this poor of a turnout. But again, this result isn't that big of a shock. Although hindsight is 20/20, it is important to understand the difference between a regular patch and a maintenance patch. To iron out bugs, a skeleton crew coupled with several modders convenes each year to provide an official update on Steam. Unlike regular content updates, this patch really only focuses on bugs, minor text fixes, and balance changes. In other words, there is no new content for the game. You will have to rely entirely on modders for that. Despite its unusual history for a Paradox title, Imperator shockingly has quite a lot in common with games like Crusader Kings 2 and Europa Universalis 4. In fact, PDX, Paradox Interactive Studios, the developer and publisher, does not have a great track record with releases. Victoria 3, their latest significant release, had a terrible crash after launch, losing more than half of their player base in a month. And it's a game that I want to come back to later because there are some striking similarities in their development history. Imperator Rome had a strong launch, with over approximately 40,000 players. For comparison, CK2 didn't even scratch 5,000 players at launch, and EU4 had 3 times that number at 15,000 players. So, by any metric, you would expect dev support to continue well into the future, but when you compare player numbers with DLC launches to newer titles like CK3 and Stellaris, the player numbers for this game are shocking in comparison. Rome only saw a few thousand additional players come to the game with releases like Heirs of Alexander and Magna Graecia. In contrast, expansions like Royal Court tripled CK3's player count for the weekend. DLC for Stellaris has been seen increasing the player count to numbers close to launch as well. A lot of people may easily write off the failure of this game being due in part to its terrible launch due to an over-reliance on Johann's favorite mana system and majorly recycled warfare mechanics from the likes of CK2, but I digress. There is also a lot of competition for shelf space with other titles. When you have a new game competing against something like EU4 that is already far more fleshed out with DLC, most of which you can get at a great discount due to its age, there isn't really a strong reason to pay full price for a map painter. I've been speaking with a fairly broad scope in mind so far, but I've name-dropped this earlier and I want to talk about Heirs of Alexander for a brief moment, Imperator Rome's first and last expansion. To narrow in, this was quite a well-received expansion, sitting at a very positive review score on Steam as of May 2024. Despite this, the actual depth of the content of the DLC for this game was incredibly lacking. I don't want to discredit the free content pack they gave out, but all of the paid content felt like it was some variation of regional mission trees with a few bizarre mechanics slapped on. Alexander had mission trees for Egypt, Anatolia, and Thrace, but it also had a wonder designer. Magna Graecia had missions for Greece, but it also had an apotheosis mechanic that allowed you to create an imperial cult. All of these additions sound interesting, but they do very little to rework or solve core issues plaguing the game since launch. And this is probably just me, but in order for Imperator to succeed, I think that it needed to be far more different mechanically than what we received, even if that ended up being unbalanced. Paradox took a huge leap from their traditional fare with Solaris, which was unlike any of their other prior offerings. The last time Paradox even touched space as a theme was with Galactic Assault: Prisoner of Power, a very famous Paradox title, which was more of a StarCraft clone than anything else. I teased it in the intro, and I'm talking about it now to raise viewer retention, but Paradox's DLC policy is something that needs mentioning. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but Paradox Interactive as a company has decided to pursue a live service model. In other words, they continue to update their games with free patches. As long as you have the base game, you receive new features. However, the model inherently relies on the idea that there will be enough players buying paid content in the first place, and that is where we run into a problem. While in the long run, this is great for continuing to monetize and make these games profitable, the actual launch game has to 1. Be entertaining enough to maintain a steady player base, and 2. Have people return to the game for DLC. Although I have touched on the latter, I think that the first point is crucial. Have you played EU4 and CK2 at launch? Even if they were by no means mechanically complex, they were still somewhat entertaining at that point in time for the grand strategy genre. And don't get me wrong, IRE was fun, at least for me on launch, and I think that it captivated a fair share of fans. This is evident with large mod reworks like Invictus, which is a colossal expansion that adds new maps, missions, and nations to the base game. But when you release an underdeveloped base game, mods like this become almost necessary to play, and even more so when development is paused. This is unfortunately a saying becoming more and more true for studios like Bethesda and Paradox, but what these studios will not fix, modders typically will. In my last video, I covered CK3's latest expansion, Legends of the Dead, and a point of contention was that Paradox's development strategy for their games creates an unhealthy relationship with their community. It's not my intention to retread threads here, but Legends was a poorly received expansion, and CK3's team has already made a thread in response to some of these complaints. But the gist of my concern is that Paradox is putting both their employees and fans in a chokehold. Legends of the Dead is also similar to Rome's DLC rollout because of reused mechanics. Legends brought back Plagues and Bloodlines from CK2, and Heirs of Alexander featured an expanded Wonder Designer, which came out around the time of Leviathan for EU4 and CK2's Great Works update. So, with that in mind, I really have to call into question support behind the free DLC strategy when mechanics we paid for in the past are rebilled to us in future installments. When the game itself is not successful, i.e. Imperator Rome, and fans still pay $80 to $100 for 1 to 2 years of DLC, it feels like a massive waste of resources when that game is inevitably cancelled. Keep in mind that people are now paying not just full price for the base game, but also $20 to $30 for expansions like Royal Court, all to keep supporting free patches. This also puts an incredible amount of stress on the modding community. What if development suddenly stops? For large rework mods like Invictus, that is hundreds to thousands of hours of unpaid work for absolutely nothing. And the free patches that we did get with the help of paid content felt very mediocre to say the least. An overwhelming amount of the player base chose nations based in Italy or Greece, but there was very little done to encourage them to play elsewhere. Aside from the Morians, most other nations outside of the Mediterranean felt very similar to each other, if not the exact same. This was such a massive missed opportunity in my opinion, and the patches that we did receive were spent fixing and adding depth to features that should have been deeper in the first place. I will cut some slack for holy sites because I found them to be interesting, but even then they were not that different from other improvements on the map. I get the feeling from reading back over the updates that there was a strong push for internal development with systems like roads and adding new pop types, but that it would have required far more active development time that this game was simply not afforded. Regardless of your stance on the matter, Paradox's current DLC model is a barrier to entry for many potential players. I see countless comments on my videos talking about pricing, inflation, why this policy is necessary, and so on and so forth. Yet I see very few comments addressing just how chaotic and nonsensical this is to an outsider's perspective who may be coming over to Paradox with fresh eyes. Cotton, or Catton, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, one of the developers has hinted that Imperator Rome could see another patch if the player numbers surpassed 5,000. The revival effort, by any measure, was a failure with only 2,000 players total. While this is a near-definitive defeat for the game's continued support, other entries like Victoria 3 could be next on the chopping block. Victoria 3 had a big advantage over Imperator Rome early on because it was riding off of the hype of Victoria 2 and a highly demanded sequel. Europa Universalis Rome didn't exactly have the same amount of hype. Victoria 3 had some mind-boggling stats for its launch, but in Paradox tradition, those numbers quickly cratered. If you compare the numbers for Voice of the People and other paid content, not only were the numbers subpar, but they also had some atrocious reviews in comparison. All of this to say is that, and while I'm not trying to fearmonger, I think there is a very common thread between Victoria 3, Imperator Rome, and how the studio handles new releases. When franchises show low staying power, they typically don't last long, and although Paradox doesn't really cancel that many of its titles, Victoria 3 isn't exactly smashing or colonizing expectations, with daily player counts regularly below 10,000 on SteamDB. One of the other reasons that Imperator Rome is all but guaranteed to be dead for good is the existence of Europa Universalis 5, otherwise known as Project Caesar. Quite ironic if you ask me, the previous director of Imperator Rome, Johan Andersson, is also directing EU5. While EU Rome was the predecessor to Imperator, a lot of the images teased so far seem to bear a similar likeness. And I may just be huffing copium, but many of EU5's teased features, like trade goods and the map layout and colors, seem to borrow from Victoria 3 and Imperator. I believe that if the game isn't going to be revived, the next best thing for EU5 would to be at least to borrow or use some of Imperator's more popular features, like more detailed provinces and unique geographical elements. Also potentially road building, because I really love that. While this may seem far-fetched, if you take a gander at some of Paradox's other precursor titles like March of the Eagles, Sengoku, and now Imperator Rome, a few things stand out. These games were all prototypes in the most literal sense. Sengoku was teasing Paradox's new version for the Clausewitz engine, and it even had familiar mechanics like character traits and council relationships. March of the Eagles is interesting because it has similarities to Victoria 2 and EU4, with a focus on Europe and incredibly similar army mechanics to EU4. And lastly, there has been some talk of Victoria 3's character portraits borrowing heavily or directly copying off of Imperator Rome's character portraits, which seems to be fairly true. Unfortunately, it may be that, in the long run, many of these quote-unquote demo games were just that, prototypes to test new or controversial mechanics that the developers didn't want to risk including in their flagship titles lest they be poorly received. At this point in time, EU5 has revealed that it is including regional markets, which look very close in resemblance to Victoria 3's market and customs union mechanics. This is all purely speculation, but if Victoria 3 falls through and Sphere of Influence does not perform nearly as well as hoped, then it would make sense to borrow some of the more popular mechanics from Victoria 3, but definitely not combat, and port it over to EU5 with better polish. I planned on getting this video out earlier, but there was far more digging that I had to do than anticipated for a game that only had 1 to 2 years of full service development, so if it dragged on for a little longer for your liking, then I apologize in advance. As a closing question though, I want to ask, what would you have done differently for this game's development? Do you think it ever had a chance, or was it doomed to begin with? I tend to stay away from older content like Imperator, but with Paradox being ever so pressing, I find it hard not to talk about its previous stumbles as they hold so much weight on the future. But if you like this video, please consider my other content where I talk about a variety of other Paradox titles and 4X games like Humankind and Civilization 6. Thank you guys so much for watching, thank you so much for the support recently, I love you guys and I hope to see you later. Alright, peace.